start off with an introduction from former State Senator Bill Carrico, and then we'll jump into it. If you have a question, please go ahead and leave it in the chat box, and I'll try to work the conversation towards those questions. Senator Carrico, welcome to Bearing Drift on Virginia Free TV, brought to you by What's Next Virginia. Thanks, Brian Sullivan, in the studio.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. It's been a real pleasure having served with you in the House of Delegates, and spent 18 years of my life up there and worked across the aisles with everyone, worked with you on issues in Stanton areas, and I've traveled extensively across the state talking and meeting people as a chairman of transportation in the Senate. And, it's good to be with you guys and talk about the issues at hand.
Well, let's just jump right into it on transportation, since that's sort of your wheelhouse. To suggest otherwise would be erroneous. What are the transportation needs of the Commonwealth, and has the pandemic affected those needs at all?
Well, the transportation needs in the Commonwealth are pretty straightforward. We move a lot of goods in Virginia. We have ports that keep our economy going. And in order to move those goods to and from locations throughout the state, we have to keep a healthy port system. And, from the ports in Fairfax, Arlington area to the ports in Newport News and all the inland ports, we have to make sure that those are operable and people are able to get goods to and from, so that the Commonwealth can continue to grow and continue to prosper. And I think that, we have looked at many options as to how we keep those goods going. As you saw last year, there was an effort just to address the I-81, 11 million vehicles a year that travels that road. 47% of them are large trucks, and they're moving goods. So we had to find a way to address that. Then they came back in this session and did an across the board increase in transportation through a gas tax, which we all know gas taxes is a regressive tax. We've got to find new ways to fund transportation than through a taxing mechanism, through a regressive tax where you're trying to make everything more fuel efficient in the upcoming years. So that's going to be a challenge moving forward, how we do that. But we've got to keep those goods moving in Virginia, or we just don't survive.
Well, any thoughts on what is a fair mechanism for funding transportation? I mean, we've seen the growth of tolling, variable
right.
toll, congestion pricing, if you will, in Northern Virginia on the 95 corridor, especially with the fast lanes there. If gas tax is regressive, so then should be sales taxes. What's a non-regressive means of funding transportation?
I don't know that we're going to be able to do. I mean, tolling and all the things that we've done in the past is just not going to be the way to go. The miles traveled would be one issue that we probably ought to look at. There's other states that are looking at that right now. But how you do that and protect people's movement and how they feel like they're being tracked by the government is the biggest challenge. And that's something that you would have to have more voluntary involvement in than anything else.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to tackle. If you want to ask a question, leave it in the chat box. I'll get to you. I can't see all hands right now. So I thought I saw one might go up. Insofar as taxation, Andrea has a question on sales tax. Andrea?
I was just wondering, and this is for anyone who wants to answer, but with all your experience, I would assume that you probably do have an opinion on a national sales tax. versus the current system? I mean, tax everything at X rate and get rid of the income taxes.
Well, I mean, if you want me to answer that, I'm a firm believer in a fair tax to where everyone pays into a tax, the lowest level to the highest level. As you know, more affluent and wealthy you are, the more you pay. And it's for goods that you're purchasing. And I think that is something that we're desperately needing to look at. I don't know how well it works just within the state, because Tennessee is much like that. They have a sales tax, no income tax, and that sales tax continues to climb. And, we would have to figure out that balance. And I don't know what that balance would be, but I would personally rather pay a sales tax than have to pay income tax. And it would make the taxing system more feasible and less complicated in the future if we had that.
Certainly more efficient. I think the new generation, especially my kids, when they talk about filling out their income tax returns, they're completely perplexed of why the heck this is so complicated. And I think that generation, you talk about a curve being flattened, the complexity in government is a curve that has to be flattened. This generation just doesn't understand it.
I figured DJ might have something to say about that question.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
DJ if you have a question, DJ.
Sorry, DJ.
Yeah, I was going to say, particularly in regards to transportation, I remember about 12 years ago during the 2008 special session, the House Delegates Republicans came up with a proposal that largely funded transportation via, I believe it was via port revenue or some sort of port revenue, which was more tied to growth than sales taxes or gas taxes. It's been too long since I had come into the details on that one, but you were in the House of Delegates on that, Senator Carrico. Is there any chance of something like that maybe coming back as a way of moving off of the gas tax and off of fuel taxes?
Well, I think it's an option that we need to put back on the table. I mean, when you talk about cargo coming in and being moved out and taxing it, it's a way that we can easily bring revenue in for the large majority of what these interstate systems and roads are carrying today. And that port revenue that you're talking about was an option that we were discussing during that period of time, but it didn't really go very far because there was too much of an appetite to just piecemeal. And every time you raise the gas tax or a sales tax to put a portion to something, you're just piecemealing it for a short period of time. Something like you're talking about with the port revenue, cargo tax, you're actually addressing it immediately, and you're addressing it for the future.
Let's move off transportation. Merle has a question on defunding the police. Merle?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for being here, Senator. As a former member of the Virginia State Police, and thank you for your service. You were outspoken about your opposition to the so-called defund the police movement. But police reform seems to be necessary in some degree in light of the abuses that we've seen even here. What would be your approach to this as governor?
Well, I appreciate the question because, there's a difference between defunding and reforming. I think law enforcement has to reform. It evolves as culture evolves. And, one of the problems that we've had in the past, and the reason we see a lot of problems, is all the cuts that have been made to law enforcement over the years. And so their ability to train and do new things kind of gets put under the radar because they have to use their money to operate. I think we should have a national registry for bad police officers. That's number one. We shouldn't be hiring bad police officers if they've left one agency and they just go to the next. I think that we need to do more training on how we de-escalate and make arrests. We're in an area of time now where people are having so many, and the mental issue is becoming so prevalent. We need all of our law enforcement trained in de-escalation and in identifying these things. Defunding police, when the government's number one job is to keep the public safe. The governor's number one job is to keep the public safe. And you're not able to operate as going to school, going to work, or gatherings without having a sense of safety. So when we talk about police reform, this conversation about defunding them, taking money away from them, is the wrong thing to talk about. We need to talk about funding them, giving them the resources, giving them the training, making them the professional agency that you want to make them, so that you don't have the systemic problems that exist. The biggest thing that you're getting ready to see is the bill that just was signed in, takes effect in 2021, of collective bargaining. What you saw in Minneapolis, what you see in Chicago, what you see in these big cities where agencies are able to unionize and collective bargaining is where the problems really begin to grow. And so what you want to do is you want to have agencies where their leaders have the ability to professionally handle these situations without having to have a union to collectively bargain with what they do with their employees. So defunding police is not the answer. Reform can happen, and I think I have the experience and knowledge on how we do that more than anyone else.
I definitely think that gives you a leg up in the nomination phase of the Republican Party and potentially even the general election, Senator. I think the last time we had you on here was without the Bearing Drift folks, but you totaled up the back of the envelope math of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus's legislative agenda going into special session. And you said it's going to be about $500 million annually, and $1 billion in the biennial budget. Is that number still pretty much where you had it before?
Yeah, you can't take away sovereign immunity and not expect to have endless frivolous lawsuits. So that's going to be a huge cost to the state. You can't
define that for our audience who are not familiar with sovereign immunity and qualified immunity.
So sovereign immunity is where an individual is trained and operating on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia to enforce the laws of that state. And, in situations in law enforcement, you have so many liabilities. Operating a car is the largest liability in the whole state. So a lot of law enforcement are in accidents, and those accidents occur. There's a limitation to what can be done as far as suits are concerned. And it goes back to the old saying, you can't sue the king. Commonwealth's the king. So, you're putting the Commonwealth in jeopardy for a lot of frivolous lawsuits that will come about from car accidents, from frivolous lawsuits saying that I was assaulted when all that happened was restraint. Qualified immunity goes much farther. Qualified immunity puts not only the Commonwealth but the law enforcement officer in the position to lose everything they've got. Qualified immunity could be me just putting my hands on you, saying, you can't advance any further. They say, well, you assaulted me. I'm suing you and your family. You're tied up in lawsuits for years. And there's no way anyone in law enforcement would continue to do the job. So you got that cost. The other cost you have is shifting from moving money from law enforcement to mental health and now hiring more mental health individuals, which are going to be required to go out and try to de-escalate someone with a knife, with a gun, and they're just not going to do that. So you're going to add more layers to it, and you're going to have more law enforcement and more mental health doing the same job that they're doing today. And
What happens
you
when
know,
you
under
call
the Woodrum
911?
Amendment, never. I'm sorry.
If you don't have I'm sorry for.
No, that's okay.
But outside of the medical part of it, you know, I mean, people complain about police officers until they need them. It's kind of like
Right.
in a medical professional, when you need them, you're really grateful that they're there. And I don't understand. I understand the argument. I understand why people feel that something needs to be done in a lot of areas with education. But I don't think that saying, okay, we're just going to have no law enforcement is, I don't think that's even comes close to being doable.
Well, go back to dialing 911. Now what you're going to have is dispatch trying to determine whether you have a mental health crisis or if you have a crisis that you need a law enforcement. And you always say it's the seconds that count when police are minutes away. And you're going to have situations where people get killed. Now they're going to sue the Commonwealth because you're going to do away with sovereign immunity and say police were not responsive, mental health wasn't responsive. And then, you know, in this reform that the Black Caucus puts out there, and what I was getting to under the Woodrum Amendment, every time you change any kind of criteria of classification, you add a $50,000 cost each time, and you figure out how many people estimated will be in violation of that. And so now you're de-felonizing assaults on police officer, making it misdemeanors. And, you know, the badge represents authority. It represents the people. The people have given that individual the authority to remain and keep order. But now you're watering that down. You're just saying, well, it's not a felony if you assault a police officer. It's just a misdemeanor. They're actually assaulting you because you gave them the authority. And so all these things that they're calling reform is nothing more than an attack to make sure that law enforcement doesn't want to respond. Now you're going in their package to only daytime service of warrants. Well, everybody knows that the criminals work under the cover of darkness, and you're not going to be able to serve warrants at night. So you're just creating another layer for the criminal enterprise to grow. And so we're not defunding police. We're building a criminal empire, and we're going to look like Chicago. And all this stuff is going to cost the
Yeah, I'll get to you in a second.
billions of dollars.
If I can, what you described, though, the process you described of the dispatcher having to make the call, wouldn't they be brought into the liability
Absolutely.
in those situations? Their judgment of whether to send a mental health professional or a law enforcement officer to de-escalate a situation, their decision-making would also be part of that process.
Absolutely. And you know, it doesn't mean that you're a sworn individual for the state to be liable under when you do away with the sovereign immunity.
DJ?
The sovereign immunity allows the state to operate in good faith without having frivolous lawsuits constantly thrown at them and end up paying out millions of dollars because a jury may not like law enforcement.
But given what we have seen in Minneapolis, given what we have seen in Washington, D.C., in Lafayette Square, given what Craig Doucette is tracking about video evidence of police abuses, and he's now in the several hundreds of examples, are we really saying that we can count on the police to reform itself and to watch itself? Are we really saying that the police must always be considered right and they must always be given the benefit of the doubt when they have not shown that they deserve the benefit of the doubt repeatedly?
No, we're not saying that, but let's look at the number of cases of teachers that molest kids. Are we saying that we can trust all teachers? Are we saying that? Are we saying that we can trust
Yes,
all doctors?
but Bill, as a teacher,
Don't interrupt, please.
What I'm trying to say is, are we saying that we can trust all teachers? Are we saying we can trust all doctors? I'm not saying that we can trust all law enforcement. No matter how much you train, no matter how much your agency is so strict on what you are to do and how you are to act as the law enforcement agency, you're going to have bad policemen. And what you're seeing and what you're explaining that's happening in large part in metropolitan areas is because they have unions that protect them. Now, sure, there's going to be bad troopers. There's going to be bad sheriff's deputies. There are going to be bad municipalities that have law enforcement. And that's why you've got to have a system to where you can address that and you can fire these individuals and you can have what, when I said earlier, a tracking mechanism and database that doesn't allow them to leave one agency and go to the next and do the same thing. That's where I think
Do you have a
we have the disconnect.
Matt, question?
well, just regarding your analogy to teachers, if as an educator, if I were to put my hands on a student, without cause, I would be prosecuted, and B, I would be fired. And that's the way it is in the profession. And what you see, as you just said, using the teacher analogy, we're not necessarily seeing that in law enforcement with the videos that Greg just said has been, that DJ referred to with Greg, who, was a Republican. He actually went to college with him down in NC State. But your analogy there, to me, doesn't make much sense regarding comparison between teachers and cops there.
Well, let me try to make that analogy a little better. Law enforcement's job is to detain an individual when they've committed a crime.
Correct.
Teachers are not.
Well,
therefore, it's impossible to do your job as a law enforcement officer without detaining or putting your hands on someone when a crime's been committed. I'm just saying, teachers, there are bad teachers. There are bad doctors. There's bad in every profession. There's no way we're going to continuously, no matter what we do in reforms, prevent bad policemen altogether. That is something that that's why the registry is important. That's why the training is important. That's why not having collective bargaining to allow unions to establish is important.
DJ, follow-up question?
Yeah, I just and I actually I'm with you on the collective bargaining issue. That drives me nuts. But the way you describe what law enforcement's job is, I'm going to go back to the issue of with the 9/11 dispatcher. Do we not have to make sure that our 9/11 dispatchers then are better trained to know situations that are emergencies, mental health issues versus situations where a crime is being committed? How many times have law enforcement been sent by 911, because that's a culture we have now, to a situation that is not necessarily criminal in behavior, but the cops get sent there because we don't have anybody else to send? Is that not the kind of thing where we need to look not just at the police culture, but also look at the 911 dispatcher culture in localities and say, wait a minute, let's train up our 911 dispatchers and our 911 structure so that they have a better idea of when not to send police officers so that the situation does not get worse instead of get better by mistake.
And I agree. I think our dispatchers do a lot of training. And I think the hardest part for them is is the panic that they hear in the voice of an individual that calls in. You know, a husband who may be having a mental crisis and threatening his wife, maybe just verbal and one that can be de-escalated, but it may be her feeling that he's going to harm her, and that dispatch is going to have a tough task to determine, do I send a law enforcement officer or do I send a healthcare worker? And it's going to require tremendous training and continuous training in order to be able to distinguish that, and they're not going to get it right 100% of the time.
One of our questions comes from one of the non-panelists, trying to have an understanding of what does it take to get a bad cop fired. And I don't know if the examples are that extreme in Virginia. We haven't, like you said last time you were with us, Bill.
Right.
You know, we don't use chokeholds in Virginia because we're not trained to use chokeholds in Virginia. So in Virginia, let's try to stick on Virginia because we have a very different construct than Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, and the like. Let's stick with Virginia because you're running for the Commonwealth of Virginia's governor. What is the current process in Virginia for getting rid of a bad cop?
So currently it is a little simpler because you don't have collective bargaining or unions that are actually taking advantage of this situation. Okay, let's start with state police where I have standards of conduct, and it's a notebook. It's probably got 60, 70 chapters of conducts that you have to operate in. If you violate any of those, you're subject to group offenses, group 1, 2, and 3, which 3 is the most severe. And, you know, you could have just forgot to file a report and get a group 1. Or you could have spoken harshly to an individual inappropriately and get a group 2. Well, a group 1 and group 2 gets you fired within a certain period of time. You can get a group 3, which means you had no authority to grab an individual and throw them to the ground. There were no threat to anyone, and be brought in and give a group 3 and fired. They have a grievance ability to grieve that to try to get their job back, but that's done by a panel of someone on the administrative staff, an individual of the choice of the person who was fired, and someone like a Commonwealth attorney or a judge. So that panel will decide, was the actions of the department fair to fire this individual? And very seldom do they not uphold the hiring and firing procedures of the department. Now let's go to the Sheriff's Department. Sheriff's Department is a constitutional officer elected by the people. Everybody that works for him is at will. He can fire anybody for anything that they do. They don't have to, if you don't like the way they wear the uniform, they can be fired. So they're another layer. They have no recourse after that. They just have to go on. And then you have municipalities. Municipalities have police chiefs appointed by the council. The council has a lot of influence on how that police chief runs his agency and can fire that police chief or have an individual in there removed also. So in Virginia, we don't have the systemic problems that other states have. But now, Chris, as of May 2021, all these county employees, sheriff's deputies and all, can unionize, and then they can start bargaining. And that's going to make it very tough. But the state can't. The state can't do it under that law.
Okay, let's move off if we can to higher education, K through 12. We're getting the back to school. Andrew, if you have a question, just go ahead and put it in the frame so we can so I can work it in the conversation. Let's just go to Andrea Epps. Go ahead and ask your question about evaluating individuals.
This last thing on police. I think that the issue comes down to the individual officer. I mean, you're good, like you said, you're gonna have good cops, you're gonna have bad cops, and it's hard. I would think it would be hard to legislate for an entire group of very, very different people. I don't think teachers can really be caught in that same classification because of the differences of their job. But doesn't it indeed come down to the individual officer and his fitness for his position, especially, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, but especially when you get into situations with race, because there are different races. There are issues with it with some police officers, and I'm thinking that I wanted your input onto how you deal with the individual police officers to make sure that you increase the system of as a whole, it improves rather than regresses.
So real quick, in 2018, I introduced a bill that required all law enforcement to undergo a mental evaluation prior to being hired. Basically, the state police does this. You go through a process of, applying, testing, polygraph, and then a mental evaluation. Not all agencies do that. So through that mental evaluation in 2018, when I introduced that all law enforcement would have to do it. In 2018, the reason is that a lot of times through those evaluations, you can determine the individual's mentality and whether they are actually racist or if they are just wanting the job for the power and abuse of it. I think that's part of what reform could be. I think that all agencies need to do those evaluations because you are in situations where the stress of the job, and that's why the largest suicide rate of any profession is law enforcement, is because so many people think that this is what they want. But when they see death firsthand, when they deal with the crushing blows of seeing a partner die, when they see all these things happen, it's not human nature to deal with it. So you have a third that deal with it by drinking. You have a third that deal with it through suicide. You have a third that just naturally can accept it. And so it's important, it's imperative that all agencies, not just the state police, but all, do some kind of evaluation before they hire an individual for that job.
How'd that piece of legislation do?
It died for cost. Other agencies felt it would be too much of a cost, and it died.
Maybe that could be introduced in a special session, huh?
So back to my $500 million in a biennial. Just think that was a small step, and how much that cost. $250,000 just to do that, or $250 million. I'm sorry.
Oh, that was your proposal was $250 million.
Yeah, pretty close to 250 because you're requiring all agencies across the board.
Right,
in the state. You couldn't put that cost back on. As well as I do, localities look at it as an unfunded mandate, so the state would have to pay for it.
Sure. All right, let's jump to K through 12 and higher education since we're in that season and it's top of mind for a lot of parents and back to school is in jeopardy. What are your thoughts on getting back to school and how good can virtual education be when most school systems don't have a virtual system set up and running?
Well, I've been a big proponent of virtual education from the day I went in because we have very remote areas in Southwest Virginia where snow days kind of makes school year round, and you have very hard time for kids to be able to get to school a lot of times, even in the snow days. I think the biggest challenge we got as far as virtual education is the ability to have broadband spread across the Commonwealth. I was on the Broadband Advisory Council. We worked to try to make sure every nook and cranny across Virginia had access to broadband internet, and until we have that, virtual education is going to be very tough. But we've got to get kids back to school. Look, I understand how contagious this virus is and how concerned people are, but statistics show the kids are the ones that are most insulated from it. They're the ones that actually don't show the symptoms like older adults. I think we've got to have a system to where our kids can at least part-time rotate, whatever, but they've got to get back into it. They've got to get back to the educational side. And we've got to, when we do this, find the ability to prevent those kids from maybe be asymptomatic, bringing that. If there's an older individual, grandmother, whatever, living in the home, we've got to find a way to be able to protect them from the disease. But by just saying, we're going to cancel school, it's just going to be very tough, very tough. We just got to get them back in there, and we got to get it moving, because kids are resilient, but when you leave them out for a whole academic year, you're just delaying everything, economy-wise, their ability to be in the workforce and all that.
Yeah, I think Matt Walton had a question or comment.
Well, you mentioned about broadband access. I've spent some time down in your neck of the woods in Grayson County with my girlfriend's family, and the broadband access there is nowhere close to where it is here in Henrico County. So let's get to some concrete policy. How are you going to get broadband access to all parts of the Commonwealth? Because it is a critical issue. And how are we going to get that done? What is your plan to get that accomplished?
Well, I think you got to prioritize it. You've got to look at the overall map of Virginia. You've got to look at cost. When you talk about Grayson County, you have geographic challenges. Anywhere in Southwest Virginia, you have mountains you got to cross. Mm-hmm. You got rock you got to go through. And those geographic challenges have a cost associated to it. So you have to be very diligent in looking at what that cost would be and making the effort to put that money to that cost. Because in the end, it's going to pay for itself by allowing people to be able to do the telenet work from home, to do the medicine from home. It will pay for itself in the end, but you've got to put the money up front to do it. And you're going to have an understanding of the exact cost. One of the things that I worked really hard on was the way that the railroad, Norfolk Southern, was gouging us. Just to cross the railroad was costing us millions of dollars. And all they were doing was a fiber optic line across railroad. And, that shouldn't happen in the Commonwealth. We shouldn't have to spend that kind of money just because Norfolk Southern decides they want to make money off the fact that you're having to get broadband to a community on the other side of the tracks. And so we've got to address those things. The cost is going to be the priority. And it's as part of your administration, if you're wanting to connect Northern Virginia to Hampton, from Hampton to Southside, Southwest to the Valley, you're going to have to connect it through broadband. You can't connect and share and become one group, one Virginia, without sharing information. And that's how we've got to build our economy in Virginia.
Well, Senator, this brings up a very interesting conversation relative not just to the dynamic of broadband internet access and getting the free technology to the kids, but also, okay, so we build this new platform of broadband throughout the country, or the state anyway, to deliver education, K through 12, higher education, which is done. There's a lot of schools that do this and do it quite well. What do we do then afterwards for the traditional school systems? Because this is gonna flatten the curve on K-12 spending dramatically. I mean, this is a paradigm shift. You don't just build this once for a 6-month build out to get kids back to school after a vaccine is built. You will have changed the entire dynamic of delivering education in the country.
Well,
which I'm not opposed to, but it's going to change.
That's the future, Chris. I mean, that's the future. Look at the dilapidated schools that we have across the Commonwealth and the cost it would take just to build more technological schools and better schools for our kids to go in. If we're going to provide education, job opportunities via what we're doing right here today, then we need to invest in that and, spend more money to expand the broadband, let our teachers teach virtually, than we would spend it in a school building. I don't know that we'll ever go away from a brick and mortar school, but we could have fewer and we could have nicer and use the virtual school education too.
Well, it's going to change the entire construct of K through 12 in this country, and
right.
Everyone's not looking at it in this. Not everyone. Most aren't looking at it in its totality. Most are looking at it to just get kids back to school in a virtual platform to get through 2020 and hopefully get something out of 2021. But in 2030, our K through 12 system is going to look very differently, and it's going to be upended by the deliberation. God, that's a horrible word, Saxman, on a Friday. The delivery of this new broadband education that we're going to see.
Let's look at our kids. We're not that young. You and I are not. But my kids, my daughter graduates from college in December. The largest majority of her education was done online. And colleges are able to use it. We haven't done away with colleges, but we have been able to expand our broadband use of being able to do this through the internet, and we've got to do the same through K-12. I think our younger kids are going to have the structural education in order to get them to the point where they can use the internet and able to use it effectively. But once they get to that point, there's the ability to do it virtually.
And I think you need to see this, I think we really need to study what this is going to look like for not just K through 12, but also higher education, because every year the legislature goes back and they fund more construction of more buildings on these campuses, and we're going to be delivering more and more of the education online. And it seems to me logically you would have the legislature, if you're going to run for governor, this is an interesting topic to discuss when you go around the state, is do you displace one for the other in your budget?
I think that's
not necessarily dollar for dollar, but you're looking at a complete shift.
But the kids, there's always going to be, especially in kindergarten, first grade, that elementary school at that level, there's always going to be a need for a human being, a teacher, to stand in front of those kids and physically be there to be able to help them, to be able to identify problems that they may not know about for a whole host of reasons, especially the younger they go. By the time you get to college, I can see where my youngest is going to Longwood in the fall. And she's actually going to Longwood. I have to move her there. But when they're little, they're so the individuals, it's the individual kids, and the need for that human being teacher to be standing in front of them is more than just the ability to teach. It's the ability to identify problems. And I would hate to see the state go so far. I believe everybody needs to have broadband. First of all, hopefully the state gets a decent easement and perpetual easement for that railroad crossing. But there still needs to be teaching wise, for education, you still need to be able to have, I don't disagree. That's why I said Okay.
that we will not do away. I mean, we'll still have to have it. It's a transition. Young kids are going to have to be taught to a certain level of how, I mean, when your most impressionable ages are those young K through probably 5th grade. By the time they get to the 6th, they're learning how to, I mean, they're mainly in labs working on computers.
Yeah,
And so by the time that they're at that 6th grade level, then, you know, we can start transitioning and trying to get to a point where we can do more virtual education. Not all are going to be that way. So we're going to have to have some type of brick and mortar.
Well, I think you're going to have to have some level of hybridization for parents to pick and choose, because to Andrew's point, you know, some kids in the early grades might need an adult, and some who are distant from a school might say, you know what, for the half an hour drive that it is to school, I'd much rather have the kid taught here or have a remote center that's closer to town where I live versus where the school is. I mean, that's just sort of where
we're always going to have learning disabilities. So there's going to have to be teachers that work with those individuals. So I don't think it's a replacement, but it's a hybrid. I think you invest in both equally to try to do both. I think you can't rely on going out and building new schools for all these schools that were built in the 1950s to update them to get them to a point where, you know, you're going to have them built for the technology of the future.
Let's shift to your internal discussion here on whether you are going to run for governor. We pushed you out there a little bit early. You've created a PAC, a secure PAC, so secure Virginia PAC.
Secure VA PAC.
And I know you've been a little under the weather. So what have you done since we've spoken, apart from creating a PAC?
Well, I'm staying engaged. I've been out speaking to several different groups about what my, you know, feeling is as far as where we have to go. As you know, in 4 years, you can't promise the moon and deliver it, because you only have 4 years as a governor. So you really have to focus on the main things that you think that are important that will move the Commonwealth forward. And the reason I came up with Secure VA PAC is that I feel it's very important that we secure constitutional rights that people understand. Look, I'm going to give you an example. Number one, what's been going on in Richmond is atrocious. The media and the leaders that are calling this peaceful protest is out of their minds. And under the Constitution, you have a right to peacefully assemble. You don't have a right to riot, burn things down, destroy property. You don't have a right to do that. It's peaceful, tranquil. It's under the Constitution. And so when you're letting groups hijack people that want to peacefully assemble, you're not doing your job as the chief executive officer. You're letting things happen that shouldn't happen. Securing those constitutional rights, the right to bear arms, all the things that I think that under our Bill of Rights that we as citizens need to know that our leaders are willing to protect is important. Securing our economy, making sure that these laws and these things that were passed that are going to kill our economy coming forward, collective bargaining. I think even though I agree somewhat with the increase of the minimum wage, that should have been the governor's job, working with all the governors across the United States to say, we need to have Congress address this minimum wage issue. We can't put Virginia against Tennessee or North Carolina or Maryland with a minimum wage issue, because we're going to lose business. They're going to go to the place that has the lowest minimum wage. The private sector has done a pretty good job in increasing that on their own. So if we need to move the level, it needs to be done nationwide. And I think as a governor, that's what one of your responsibilities are, that you don't put your state behind the 8 ball. And the other one is a lot of the green energy initiatives that they did that's going to just drive the cost of doing business through the roof with the cost of energy and building for the future and so forth with the regulations that are going into place in 2020 or 2030 because they bumped it up. So all those things is going to be important to the next governor as to how we get this economy going. The other thing is education. And we talked a little bit about that, my ideas as far as looking and gravitating more to a virtual type education along with bricks and mortar, but also the fact that, education, my opinion in education, higher education is we need to look at the tuition structure. Someone going into a job that's a police officer, a nurse, a teacher, are not going to have the ability to pay back that college loan the way that a doctor, an engineer, because of the salary rates. That structure, that tuition structure should be based on how the ability of that individual to pay that back is going to be in their future. And there should be some kind of reward if that individual in those public sectors are willing to stay and teach and to work in that sector, a reduction of 25% to their student loans when it comes to that, because most of those educational opportunities in college are done by adjunct. They're not done actually by professors. So, we need to look at that structure to make it affordable for everybody, especially those that are wanting to go in those fields that we're so short in and can't keep people working. And the last thing is public safety. I think, right now, more than ever, we need to have law and order in this state, and we need to make sure that people are protected, that professional law enforcement are out there doing this job and that they're paid adequately for it, that our kids are protected when they are at school or when they're out in a gathering, you and your family on vacation, on the highways when you're traveling. Public safety is the #1 job of the governor, to make sure. That's why he's the chief executive officer, to make sure that you're safe and that you're able to go to work and to play. That the uprising or the riot that occurred on the 25th should have never happened. They had the flyers that came out that said, Richmond will stand with Portland. We'll burn down. We'll fight the police. That within itself, that flyer within itself made it an unlawful assembly. Why our leaders can't see that, I will never know. So the safety of individuals is the #1 job, to make sure people are protected.
Let's do some.
And those are the 4 things. Those are the 4 things that I think is most important.
We'll come back to that. I want to ask you a final question, but let's do some follow-ups. DJ McGuire, Matt, and then Andrea. Follow-up, brief follow-up.
There we go. In particular regarding Richmond, given the events of the previous 2 months prior and the numerous evidence of police escalation and police aggression and frankly police violence in Richmond in June and in early July, are we really saying that the police are, to pull us back to an earlier discussion, immune from criticism and responsibility in their own escalation of the situation on the streets of Richmond for most of the summer?
I don't think that they're immune from anything. Everyone has an opinion of what they feel the police did. I don't think, when you're met with that kind of resistance and you're put out there and your leaders are not standing behind you, the police are at their wits' end as to what direction are we supposed to go. I mean, leaders, this was a political issue. And the leaders washed their hands of it and left law enforcement out there to try to fend for the people whose businesses were being targeted, whose that the streets are being overtaken by. And then they just fire the police chief. And then they just criticize the agencies that are out there. Yes, you've got to meet that resistance, or they'll just take over the city. And they felt they had a responsibility to protect them. And, you know, this idea that law enforcement wanted to be out there and wanted to be targeted, I just don't believe that. I think they were out there because they were sent there, and the leaders left them standing there with no one to give them direction or to help them to do the job they were sent there to do.
Somebody told them to fire tear gas into the crowd.
Tear gas is used to move the crowd. If you're going to begin to, if an unlawful assembly is declared and you're not going to leave and you're going to resist, tear gas is one of those issues and one of those methods to move the crowd, because you're outnumbered. The only way to move the crowd is with the gas. And it's a non-lethal way of doing things.
Matt Walton, follow-up question.
Well, just you're talking about running in, potentially jumping into the gubernatorial race. If you do, you're going to try and do something that hasn't been done since 2009, and that's when statewide is Republican. What message, or how would you plan on reaching out to build a governing and winning coalition amongst all aspects of Virginia that you were talking about during the broadband discussion, in order to become the first Republican since 2009 to win statewide in Virginia?
Well, I think, just my relationship over the 18 years with legislators, with communities across the state, and my willingness to work. I mean, look, I'm a regular guy. I'm like everybody else out here. If I do this, it's going to be a huge sacrifice for me to do it. I don't have a wealthy war chest that I'm going to be able to live off of. I've got to do without to run for governor. So if I do this, it's a sacrifice. No one, I believe, that is going to be in this race has sacrificed more than I have. I've got scars on my body to show the sacrifices I've given to this Commonwealth through car accidents, through protecting people. I have a real concern about where we're going as a Commonwealth if we don't change directions at this time. I want to make sure Virginians are safe and that they are prosperous. And I don't know of anybody in the Commonwealth of Virginia that don't agree with that. I want to make sure that if they want to work, and that there's an economy that is healthy enough for everyone to have a job. If they want their kids to go to school, that there's an opportunity and a pathway for them to go to college. If they want to go on vacation, or if they want to walk through Richmond, that they're not being targeted by organizations that are targeting many areas in the state. I want to make sure they're safe. I want to make sure they're prosperous. I want to make sure they have opportunities and that their constitutional rights are not infringed upon.
Andrea,
I have if it's all right, a two-part question. The first part is about you've mentioned several times collective bargaining. My maternal grandfather was a coal miner in West Virginia, so I know a little bit about that part of unions. And I don't agree that someone should be forced to join a union and have that money taken out of their paycheck. But absent that, isn't it a right of assembly? I mean, not assembly. A right of any group of individuals who want to associate themselves.
Association.
minus the requirement to have dues taken out. That's the first part of the question. The second part was and thank you for giving consideration to running for governor, because it is a sacrifice for just about anybody. But what do you think? What would you do, if anything, to help people that are in a situation with like multi-generational households where they have kids at home and they're taking care of an elderly relative who can't be left alone? It hits a family's pocketbook really hard. Yes, I'm in that situation, so that's why I'm asking. But has anybody mentioned that to you yet? And do you understand the unique issue of the sandwich generation?
Let me answer it real quickly. Collective bargaining and being a part of a union is two different things. Yes, I'm from the coalfield region, and yes, there was unions in the coalfields. But in Virginia, there's a right to work law. Those unions can't shut down the mining industry. If you don't want to work, that mining industry has the right to bring people in and do that job. Therefore, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the right to work law helped keep those businesses going, even though they probably did some collective bargaining. You couldn't shut the company down. If we reverse that, then we're going to see a lot of businesses lose. The other part is, for as many administrations as I can remember, we have done so much in feeding hungry kids, backpack buddies. We did all these things. We've perfected that. We've done a lot for children who are in need, and we've got to continue that. That's just something as people that we've got to do. But there's one group of people that we have left out, and that's the elderly. And that's the men and women who have done everything that they possibly can to work and to be producers for the Commonwealth and make the Commonwealth what we are today. And that's our older generation. That's the dad and mom that you're talking about, that you're having to care for. I think now it would be under a Carrico administration, that we do some focus, not only on feeding those kids, but making sure that generation doesn't go hungry, that generation that's put in all that time to make the Commonwealth strong and healthy is able to survive in their older years. And I think that we do that in the same sense that we did with a younger generation of kids that were in need, that didn't have food when they went home from school or breakfast when they got to school.
But what
We've
about
got to make sure.
Thank you, Andrea. Bill, where are you in your decision-making process? We're a little over time here. We're trying to keep. Where are you?
As you know, I started the PAC, and the PAC's been up and going for a couple of weeks. I'm collectively making everyone know that it's out there. I'm trying to collect supporters through that PAC to see where I am sometime mid-September. If that group of supporters agree with this message, and that's built to a certain level that I feel comfortable that we are actually have the right message for Virginia, then you're probably going to hear something by October 1.
By October 1. If you're on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I'm in, 1 there's no way in hell, where are you?
I would say I'm probably a 5 or 6 right now.
5 or 6.
Yeah.
Do you want to be governor?
I do. But you know what? I also understand that we are in a climate right now of a presidential race, and that's getting overshadowed. And it's hard to get your message going when you have a 2020 race with a very controversial presidential race going on.
Well, that's a fair answer, and I like that you are being as deliberative as you are, because frankly, you've been in a number of political races, not just in the state house. You also ran for Congress. You ran for state senate. You know the state. You're well acquainted with the state over the 18 years you served in the General Assembly. Thank you for your service there, and as state trooper. I know you'll make the best decision for yourself and what you see as the best interest of the Commonwealth. Bill Carrico, former state senator, thank you for joining us on Friday afternoon. Hopefully it's a little cooler down where you are than where we are.
Nice and cool here.
We could use a little bit of that coming through. It's been a little oppressive, but that's just July in Richmond. So, Bill, best to you and your family there. Hello to Paula, and I hope the folks down there have been affected get healthy real soon. Thanks for your time, Bill.